So we're here in the gallery at St. Peter's, Michael, with your installation, Afterlife Bodies. This has been here for several weeks, and I come into this building every day. And being in this space, one of the things, and being surrounded by these works, which are literally surrounding us, there's of course the title of the work, which bodies, very corporal. But what I'm curious for you is, did that title, Bodies, come before the work or after the work? Was it, how did there's such depth of meaning in the word itself, and there's such depth of meaning in these works. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious, which came first? Or is it both, is it a kind of a both and sort of a thing?
It was kind of happening at the same time, because when I started making the work, which was in 2013, I was already working with rice as a material in my practice, and I was thinking about rice as a way to represent the body, but the body beyond the figure. I wanted to talk about themes related to afterlife and about interconnectedness, and so I was looking for a material that could represent the body, but wasn't tied to the figure. And my upbringing, my dad was an artist, and so I was fairly traditionally trained in representational art. And so I had, you could say, mastered the ability to paint figures and portraits and things like that. And so I had always had this inclination to represent various aspects of humanity, the human condition. That theme continued on, but what I found was that the trying to represent representation or the figure became very limiting in terms of the way that I felt and about the human condition, and so I wanted to expand upon that idea. So when I started to think about a material, I was also thinking about my own experience growing up as a Filipino American, and that rice was something that we ate every single day. And so in a lot of ways, rice was our bodies were rice, but I also wanted a material that could speak to a broad audience. Mm-hmm. So I knew that rice was something that was consumed by many different cultures. It was a primary source of sustenance in the world, and it was also used not only as a food, but as a material and ritual, in celebration and mourning. And so there was many different ways in which this medium that I had chosen to use in my work could be interpreted, which I was very interested in that. And so when I started to work with the rice, I had to char some rice for a installation that I was making, where I was putting rice in this trough, and then the rice would pour out of this kind of a feeding trough, and this burnt rice was pouring out. And I just happened to be working on a piece of plywood, and I saw the image of the charred rice on the plywood for the first time, and the after image that it left behind. And so it really just struck me as this really as a kind of a pivotal moment in terms of capturing this thing that I was talking about, which was kind of the death of this body, right? But it also creates this very explosive moment in the work and what's left behind that, for me, really speaks to life. Creation speaks to the genesis of life in a lot of ways. And so the Afterlife Bodies, it's kind of since I was fairly trained, traditionally trained, and know the high value placed on representational art throughout art history, calling them bodies is kind of almost a play on that dichotomy between figuration, representation and abstraction. And it's I know that can be confusing, but for me it's a way to frame it, without and kind of throwing it off, throwing someone off a little bit, in terms of how they think about the work, but then they see the work and it's abstract.
It sounds like the choice of rice to, in a sense, convey the body,
yeah,
opens up the possibilities for thinking really even about our own bodies. Mm-hmm. In the process itself, when you char maybe we should say something about the process, but
Yep.
I'm imagining that you have the rice piled, and then you're torching it, you're charring it. Is there anything left? What is left? Is there anything left in the process?
Yeah, so how I make the work is I as you say, I lay the plywood down, and then I arrange the rice, and then oftentimes I would be working on specific sites because of course you can't burn inside of buildings. And being from the suburbs of Tennessee, it's like, if you wanted to build a fire, you just walk out your door and you put a fire in your yard. But like here, it's very hard to do that. So that was one of the initial challenges. The first burn panel I made at a metal shop at my college. But after that, it was this challenge of like, I want to continue making this work, but there's nowhere I can make it, and I don't want to be illegal about it. So I would work with galleries or like property owners, and it was very much about finding the site. But the process, yes, it happens outdoors. You lay the plywood down on a platform or something, and then I arrange the rice and objects, and then I burn it with a very intense torch. And then what's left behind is typically fairly burned rice, but there is a lot of rice that survives, and then of course the objects that get charred. And then just by taking the objects off and tilting the plywood panel forward, most of the rice falls off, but then some of the rice, like when you burn rice in your pan, it sticks to it. And I just will very delicately knock that rice off of the surface. But there's like a level of the rice that remains on the wood because it, as it breaks down, it kind of secretes and it like sticks to the wood. And so there is rice like in the work itself, but most of it's gone. So, and I always keep all the rice. So all the rice that I've used over the years has been collected in airtight, sealed containers, and I still have all of it in my studio and plan to do something with it at some time, but have not figured out what yet.
So you've, in the same way that these are cared for, you've also cared for the remains in a sense.
Yeah, I feel like there's something that's really challenging about working with food in your art, especially with, all of the issues of hunger and in the world, that like, I do feel a responsibility to keep, not like necessarily to keep it because I feel bad, but a responsibility to use it properly and like to not like deter myself from using it, but to recognize its significance and to honor that. And so part of that is that and being that I'm an artist that often scavenges and often like reuses materials or recycles materials in my work, there's that component as well. But there is a sense of like that I see the sacredness in it, especially through the ritual, and that like this process of burning and the process of like arranging the rice on the surface and all of that, and then the process of burning, it all feels and is somewhat of a ritual that I've created in the work, in the practice of making it. And in that, similar to the Eucharist, it imbues it with this meaning and this power that I can't just like toss, in a garbage can as soon as it's done. Like there's something about it. And I haven't necessarily, I have ideas, but I haven't necessarily like found the right way in which I'm going to use it. So I'm holding it, but I know at some point it's going to make sense and it'll be there and all of its richness and history and will be, in that rice ready to be used. So.
It's interesting, you started off talking about searching for some material, some way of conveying the body that was not sort of traditional depictions of it. And you come to this material, which in a sense is a kind of a stand-in in a way for a body. And as you're describing, even caring for these panels and caring for the remnants of the rice itself, I can't help but think, when bodies themselves die, they're cared for. And you think about and every culture has a different ritual around death, but it all involves care for the body, whether it's cremated and returned to the environment that way, or if a body is buried into the ground, there's a deep intentionality, and there's a sense that, okay, there's an end to one type of life, but a returning to another. How does that factor? Does that factor into your thinking around these works, or the materials, or the process, or what you hope people will see and experience?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, I was raised in a Christian home, and very much, and grew up in America, and very much about Western culture is about preserving, about honoring the body, about preserving the body, about and almost like an illustration or a preparation for afterlife. And then I know from some cultures, like I think about the Tibetan sky burials, for instance, where because of the limitations of the landscape and the way in which they think about the body after death as an empty vessel, they have these monks that break the body down and literally feed it to the birds of prey. And all of these different illustrations of the various funerary practices around the world all inform this work. And I find deep meaning in all of them. I actually was very moved by some of these more, think of that idea of just taking a body and putting it out on the side of a mountain and letting it be consumed by birds. But I think there's something that's so immediate and beautiful about that, and very much in what I'm trying to say with the work when kind of thinking about this idea that when we, both in life and in death, we are consumed, that we are consumed every single day by the people that are around us. They feed off of us, their souls feed off of our souls, and in a sense they are nourished. And in the same way, when you die, part of you lives on in the people that are around you, and you are continually feeding the people that come after you, and the people you feed off of your ancestors in a lot of ways. So it's we are a continuous source of nourishment through memory, through all of these different things. But then there's also the idea of the physical, the metabolic breakdown of the body after death, and a lot of Western cultures won't allow that to happen so easily. In terms of putting in a casket and the way in which the body is preserved, it takes a lot longer. But then, I had a professor in college that was insistent upon when she died that she wanted to be buried wrapped in a cloth directly into the ground, because she was a very well-known eco artist in New York, and it was very important for her to reduce that separation between her belief that we return to the earth, which I too believe, we return to the earth as food to nourish new life, and it continues this cycle of life. But it also, for me, is a beautiful illustration, which I try to bring up in this work, which is that I talk about it as bodies, but you don't see figures. And you ask that question, well, what is the body? The body is everything. And it's not just one body, I call it the bodies, because there's more than one body in the work, and they look exactly the same. And also everything around it looks exactly the same. So it's about this that we're all made of the same thing, and that we're all interconnected. We are sacred. Our matter is sacred. Everything that was created is sacred. And in the same way that if we can look at other people that way as well, see them as sacred matter, we see ourselves as sacred matter and see God as sacred matter, then maybe we would treat people differently.
Yeah. And each of these traditions, whatever the culture they come from, is about honoring that great circle of life. And I think it was beautiful thinking about your mentor and this idea of just simply wrap my body in a cloth and bury me into the ground. It's not just simply eco-friendly, we are made from the things of the earth. That's one of the reasons I find the idea of rice being representative of the body to be so compelling, because what is it? It's a product of the earth. It's the fruitfulness of the earth, and standing in for the body in a sense. It feels so natural.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean that's something that was a very core, like, early kind of thing that I took on, was this idea that we are contained, or that this, we live in especially in Western culture, but we live in this belief constantly that, like, everything is in control, everything is contained, buildings stand still, your body stays the same, it holds you, like all of this idea. But if if you look at just like like a garden that has been left uncared for a couple years, completely just like overgrown and starting to break the concrete, it's just like this idea, this illusion of containment is like something that I really try to challenge, but I think it's actually really beautiful and should be a really beautiful illustration of how we should live. Yes, we all have various belief systems, for instance, that like, cause a lot of issues in this world, but like I think that we live in fear that we can't be accepted, but I believe that, like, if we start to talk about what we believe, we will find that there is these commonalities amongst all of us. But I think that, like, that the important thing is to do this out of love, and not out of this, like, need to change, need to influence, need to say your idea is wrong, my idea is right, I'm going to try to change you. More of that you should come to the table and say that, like, I believe these things, what do you believe? Like, how can we find commonality? Also about that interconnectedness and finding that we are all the same rather than we're different.
I love this image of thinking about a garden that's allowed to grow, and what will it do naturally, and how will it flourish naturally, and finding beauty in that. As opposed to, there's beauty in highly curated things as well, but it's a different sort of a beauty. And perhaps embracing the more natural beauty is something that we could all learn from. I think these works definitely speak to that.
Thank you.
But interestingly, all of them, as you said, were made not out in rural Tennessee, where you could where you could do this without needing a permit. You've done all of these in New York City.
Yeah.
When you think about the built environment that is New York City, which is in a sense is amazingly built, almost overbuilt. You go to each of these different sites and set this up, and each of them, and maybe you could talk a little bit about this, is imbued with the location where the work itself was created.
Yeah. So
the Gowanus, didn't you find something? You pulled something out of the Gowanus Canal.
Yeah, they had pulled stuff out of the Gowanus Canal and handed me and said, "You can burn this," and I was like, "Oh, great!" That was like so excited. But yeah, every single site that I go to, just like as like we can all, I feel like we can all relate to this. But growing up in the suburbs, like one of the things I loved to do the most as a child was just to walk around and find, like, walking through the woods and finding stuff and picking up little things. When I work in a site, it's kind of a way for me to kind of like acknowledge it, and to say that, like, there's something there that I need to find. I'm looking for what I call, like, traces of life. Traces of humanity, and it could be like things that people could find very significant, little, like cross or something I might find on the ground list, for example, or it could be like a piece of garbage. But for me, it's about like so much of the kind of the meaning behind the work is about this interconnectedness with living things, but also with the earth, and with this idea of history and of time. And so, like, I want to pull that into the work and try to represent that as well. We can't just like talk about the body, we also have to talk about like the body and the world, and so that's a component of it. So I am collecting objects and I'm arranging them with the rice. Also, since I'm having to do this in the public, there's also like a lot of intrigue around like, what is this guy doing burning rice on plywood? This is really weird and interesting. And so I'll have a lot of people walk up to me and ask me what I'm doing, and like, I talk to them about it. And I love, like, one of the best gifts about making this work is the stories that people tell me. As an artist, like, there's a lot of gifts that you get. Like, there's a lot of things that you do for the world, but there's a lot of things that the world gives you, and that's one thing the world gives me, which is just the stories that they tell me about their experiences with rice, their experience with culture, related to rice or ritual or ceremony. And that for me is just like the reason, this is the reason why I make this work. It's like, not only am I trying to illustrate and talk about this interconnectedness and about helping people to, which is like what my work has always been about, which is helping people to like not be afraid of death and not be afraid to think about afterlife, but to really consider these ideas, because I think that they so inform how you live as a human being that I think you really need to think about it like sooner than later. And it's not so that like you'll be ready to die, but I think it's that it helps you to like understand your place in this world and like what it means. And like I just couldn't imagine like living life without like thinking about this. Since I kind of grew up around an artist and like was very formally trained and got really good at it, I really didn't like this idea that I was creating something that someone else couldn't do. And so very much about like being able to bridge this gap and talk about connection with people was to create a process that was relatable. And it's like we all burn wood. We throw wood in fireplaces. We go to camp, bonfires. We've all had this experience. I didn't want people to be like, oh, that's like really highly polished object. I'll never be able to figure out how they made that. Like I want them to understand that. And then I also invite them to partake in the process. And I love it because like, I'll have like kids that, love putting their hands, so they just like love digging their hands in these huge containers that have rice that I have, because I'll have to have like sometimes 50 to 100 to 200 pounds of rice on hand for a single burn. And they love digging it in and then like throw it. Of course they throw it and like half of it doesn't get on the board, but that's also really like kind of like beautiful for me. So yeah, it's the public component is a really nice added like benefit. So
the challenge of doing this work in the city sounds like it also is, there's a gift to it, which is all these people that can so easily gather around and not only observe you at work, but participate in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's amazingly accessible.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm curious, so each of these sort of having to be made in these different sites, these different locations, and you're sort of pulling items and objects from the surroundings, either because something has been thrown into the Gowanus Canal, it comes out, or the location, when you arrive there and you're sort of thinking about, I'm doing this work in this particular location, what's this, I guess the thing that I'm wondering about is, what is it like to be there, to be in this environment? You have a process that you've brought to different locations, but I imagine is there something about each location that is sort of brought in to the work, and not just simply, okay, this was an object that was found, but you talk about Rice, you talk about these works with almost human-like characteristics, and I'm curious if that extends to the location itself.
Yeah, I think that, I think that I'm, try to be, I try to be susceptible to like the surrounding, and like to really listen to it. That's part of the walking. So when I had the treat of working with a really great mentor in college, and he was a walking performance artist, and we did a lot of, Caitlin and I, my wife, did a lot of performances with him, and it was just merely walking. And at first, I also have a very rich background in performance art, which I started in undergrad, and a lot of my performances were about, create, and I think performance offices is about creating this space, and within that space you create a world. And then it was interesting about sensing how the kind of space that you've demarcated with the air that you've created through your presence as a performance artist, you are kind of pushing against the world, and then the world pushes back against you. And then I'm very interested in that moment when that line is crossed and the world enters into my work and starts to inform me as the artists. And so that same, tension that I'm feeling of like walking the site and trying, in a sense, to have a conversation with it and say, like, tell me about you, and like kind of, in a sense, like taking it in, and then going to deciding on the site and setting up, kind of demarcating the space, and then I kind of like, as I'm working, there's several different layers of infiltration that are happening. People watching you, me looking out, but then there's this moment when I feel like the environment starts to like infiltrate, and like I think it takes time in being in the space. I don't know if this answers your question, but I think it takes time being in this space to start to sense that. I think a lot about, like, for instance, like when I have a few like performances that I wrote that use rice in them, and one of the performances I wrote is actually based off of the Eucharist. It's called In Remembrance of Me, and this performance is basically like, the performance starts with this like kind of floor podium, and there's this 100 pounds of rice wrapped in linen, and I come out. I wash my hands in this like basin, and then I slowly unfold this linen. The linen's like, I think the linen, one of them was like 50 feet long and like 20 or 30 feet wide, and I like spread it all out, and then the rice is in a mound, and then I slowly kind of split the rice up, and like spread it all out on the podium, and then I start to cut it, and then I take samples of or handfuls of the rice into my hand, and then I go over and I pour them into people's hands, and then I ask them to pass it on, and then they pass it on to the next person. The rice, in a sense, starts to take on that bodily form the moment I touch it, right? It starts to become sacred for me, not in a way that I'm like saying that I'm like an ordained priest or anything like that, but it's just like, and I want people to sense that,
it's
like
deeply human.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. And it's like the same, this same idea that I think about, that like there's a primal quality to when we touch certain materials. I think rice does that for me. When I hold rice, I feel like basically the world in my hand. Mm-hmm. Just in some ways, that when someone plants a tree and they like dig the soil with their hand, that history, that connection between your hand and the soil goes back so many thousands of years, that connection all the way back to the creation. And that like you can feel it in that moment, like what that means. You know what I mean? You don't even have to say it. So.
It sounds like there's a lot that, even all the planning in an openness like that, there's a lot that ultimately is outside of your control.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think more in my performances, there's been like things that have happened, that like were outside of my control, and I was, just kind of have to like go with it. And it's like, hopefully it's positive. So, but yeah, I can never like predict like when the significance of a series, like a new Burn series, because I think there's 4 of them now, 4 different sites that I've done. The Afterlife bodies, like the ones behind us, are the oldest and the longest running of all of the rice burn works. I started them in 2013, and they're still going to this day. And they're a separate series to the location-specific ones, but they're still made in public as well. So,
and they're of course displayed here in public.
Mm-hmm.
People come into this space for any different times of the day, for all manner of reasons. There's one of the city's most active senior centers is here. There's a whole bunch of people who either live or work in Midtown who stop in here for some sort of respite or some sort of care or rejuvenation. It's one of the most public parts of the city is Midtown. What's it like to bring these works, which are made in a variety of areas around the city, to this place?
Well, I mean, it's a huge honor. I mean, just knowing the history of this gallery and this site, for me, like its rich history as both a place where many artists have shown, even before this building was building, the original church, and that history, but also just this place as, like the Nevilleson Chapel, and like the history that brings in terms of the level of art that she made, and then the Vignelli designed, St. Peter's Sanctuary and almost every component of the site. But also the community aspect of this as well, and that, like, as you say, it's a hub, in the middle of Midtown, which is a hub in a sense, an intersection, a major intersection of this city, if not the most important intersection of this city, and that this sits at kind of like the nucleus of that intersection. It's incredible, the community aspect of this church, and that it brings all walks of life, all ages, all interest into this single space, and that it's safe, and that it's open, and that people want to come here, and they feel welcome. Like, that's very much what this work is about. So to have it here was, it's a big honor for me, just to be able to, have that, to, in a sense, like, frame this work, because it is frameless, so it needs a frame, but to frame this work under that larger message and under that idea is, like, really important, because it is very much what this work is about. It's about talking about interconnectedness. It's about talking about how we are all the same. It's talking about finding commonality. I've always tried to make my work accessible and understandable and relatable, and, like, I want people, like, when they come to see the work, to be like, oh, that's rice. I know what rice is. I know how to make this. I know how to, or, like, I know this process. This is just charred wood, and it's just, like, that I feel like is very much what this church is about too. It's like, in this gallery, in this site, it's about, like, coming in and without pretension, you don't have this air, but it has all of that too. It has this respect and this, like, reverence, and it's like, but that it doesn't necessarily shove it down people's throats. It's more that it, like, exudes it, since, like, calls that out of you, so it's a great opportunity to be able to show here. Yeah.
Well, for a few weeks, you've given us the gift of being able to walk into this space and be surrounded by it. I'm curious, as a sort of a final question, for those people who come in, no matter what, maybe they came in to see the work in particular, they were coming in for something else, they've been confronted by this work. What do you hope that they would take home with them? How do you hope that this work will impact their lives?
I really hope that, like, that people, when they come see the Rice work, that I really want, like, it's always been a major theme in my work, that I really want people to think about, like, their life in, I think, a deeper way. There's this, like, life gives you this opportunity, to really make a difference. And it doesn't have to be a difference where you're, like, standing on a podium and, like, leading protesting or anything like that. It's like you can make a difference every single day in people's lives. And, like, I think what the work for me, or I hope, is that it's a message of, through the accessibility of, like, recognizing what it is, through the openness of not being constrained by, like, representation, and in that way prescribing some kind of meaning upon them, that they see the expansive nature, they see that they understand how it's made, they know that it's rice, they see the open and expansive nature of it, and then that for them inspires them, that, like, they can, like, also, in a sense, like, think that way, that they can think outside of the box, and, like, to start to challenge, like, some of the notions that we have around, we are rigid and we have to be stuck in these ways, and then once we decide upon this way of life, that we have to, like, maintain it or, like, feed it, and it's, like, very much my work is about, and I hope that people get out of the work, is that you can, like, evolve, you can be fluid, and you can change, and and in a lot of ways, I don't know if people get all of that from the work, but that, like, that's my hope. There's also, like, I think a heavy component to the work, in that it's, like, charred rice, so people immediately think, oh wow, this has a weightiness to it. If you think about rice, it's a precious material. It's something that can feed you. It's something that has meaning to you. It's something that, like, has all of these different usages across the world. And it's a precious thing, and I'm burning it. And I think that, like, could be somewhat jarring to a lot of people, but it also might be like, it is very precious, and like we shouldn't take things for granted, you know. So I'm hoping that you know, part of it comes out in the work. And then again, if they think about it in terms of the way that I title the work, which is Afterlife Bodies, then they're like, well, there is no body, but what is the body? You know, so it's these questions about body, about identity, about representation, you know, and that like it's a very abstract way in which to think about it, but also like an opening and expansive way to think about it. So I hope that they like kind of reconsider that in a way.
And we each have a body.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to challenge that. We as people have bodies. We as people are contained figures. But I do, like I said, go back to this idea that like, I think that the skin that holds us isn't necessarily, it works counter to actually the thing that we are inside, which is this expansive body that does want to influence, that does want to make change, that does, you know, want to intertwine with the other. We are not made to be, you know, isolationist. We are not made to be individualistic. We are made to be in community, and like, I hope that comes through when we think about rice as the body.
I think that's what you've invited to us, us too, with this work.
Yeah.
So thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.